Welcome to our podcast episode Language Education Policies in Colombia Equity, Coloniality, and Accountability in Tension. Today we are with Maciel Mejia, Marlene Sarrieta, and your host Gloria Moreno. So, we will reflect on one central question. Are bilingual and multilingual education policies truly inclusive, or can they reproduce inequality when only certain languages are valued? This question matters because language policies are not neutral. According to Lopez Urbina in Module 2 on language education policy, language policies influence curriculum, teaching methods, materials, assessment, teacher education, and economic resources. Therefore, they are also shaped with language and identities are recognized in schools and universities.
Thanks, Gloria, for having me. Exactly. When we talk about language policy, we also talk about power. In Colombia, English has been strongly associated with opportunity, competitiveness, and global mobility. But we need to ask opportunity for whom? If English becomes the main symbol of quality education, what happens to indigenous languages, Creole languages, local varieties of Spanish, and students' cultural identities?
So that is where equity, coloniality, and accountability become central. By accountability, we mean the use of standards, tests, and indicators to evaluate whether a policy is working. This can be useful, but it becomes problematic when language learning is reduced to number and social inequality is ignored. Today, we will discuss three tensions: English and neoliberal agendas, coloniality, and indigenous languages, and accountability in bilingual education.
Let's begin with English. Why has it become so central in language education policies?
Well, in many Latin American countries, English is connected to economic development, internationalization, and probability. In Colombia, this is visible in the National Bilingualism Plan and the Bilingualism Law. Teaching English is not negative. The problem appears when English is treated as the only valuable language or as the main indicator of educational quality. Miranda and College, in their 2024 study, on multilingual policies in Colombian higher education, explained that Colombian languages policies have often prioritized English and have been influenced by external benchmarks, international tests, and an English Spanish model of bilingualism.
Exactly. This creates inequalities, right? So students from private schools or urban contexts usually have more access to qualified teachers, materials, or exposure to English. Meanwhile, students from rural, indigenous, or under-resourced contexts are often evaluated with similar standards, even when their conditions are very different. So English can open doors, but it can also become a gatekeeper.
That is a key idea. English can be both an opportunity and a barrier.
Exactly. For that reason, bilingualism should not be reduced as Spanish plus English. A more inclusive policy should recognize students' complete linguistic repertoires.
Uh, Now let's talk about coloniality. How does coloniality persist in language education?
Well, coloniality persists when some languages are considered more useful, modern, or prestigious, while others are treated as less valuable. This is connected to historical processes where indigenous language were marginalized and dominant languages were imposed. Lopez Urbina in Module 2 remind us that assimilationist educational practices historically forced children to learn dominant languages, separating them from their communities and contributing to the loss of native languages.
Okay, as we know, Colombia is clearly a multilingual country. Lopez Urbina also explains that Colombia has around 68 native languages spoken by approximately 1 million people in 115 communities. So the model also mentions indigenous languages, Creole languages, and the Romani language. However, many of these languages are at risk.
So, if Colombia is multilingual, why do many policies still focus mainly on English?
Well, this is one of the main contradictions. Gutierrez and Frias Espinaju, in their 2024 study about the Wayu people, show that coloniality continues to affect language and education policies, especially when institutions talk about diversity but do not provide enough concrete support for indigenous language maintenance.
Exactly. Inclusion cannot be only symbolic. Real inclusion requires funding, trained teachers, community participation, culturally relevant materials and spaces where indigenous languages can be used with dignity.
So, language should be seen as a right and as a resource, not as a problem.
Yes, students should not be forced to abandon their mother tongues in order to become bilingual. Their languages should be part of their learning process.
Well, let's move to accountability. How does it affect language policy?
Well, so accountability helps institutions evaluate whether policies are working in Colombia. Okay, so national and international tests are used to measure language competence, and the Common European Framework has influenced standards, curricula, and proficiency levels. As Lopez Urbina explains in Module 2, standardized tests such as Saber Pro, and international exams are often used to evaluate the result of language policies. However, this type of accountability must be interpreted critically and contextually.
Exactly. A fair accountability system should ask more than what level did the students reach. It should also ask, did students have access to qualified teachers? Were their languages and cultures respected? Did the policy reduce inequality or reproduce it?
That means accountability should include social justice, not only test results.
Exactly. So language is not only a technical skill, so it is connected to identity, culture, power, and belonging. So if assessment ignores students' linguistic repertoires, it may punish diversity instead of varying it.
Okay, the activity also invites us to compare policy approaches. What can we learn from other contexts?
Well, one useful comparison is the Basque Country, discussing the course material through Xenos. So this case shows us that minority language revitalization requires long-term planning, so institutional support and social commitment. So that means that it is not enough to say that a language matters. Policies must create real conditions for its use.
Exactly. Latin America also offers important lessons. Fabrega and College, in their 2021 report on foreign languages teaching policies, showed that these policies require clear planning and contextual understanding. Since formal education is often the main opportunity for many students to learn another language, policies must consider inequality in access, teacher preparation, and school resources.
So, what can educators and institutions do?
First, they should recognize students' full linguistic repertoires, including Spanish, indigenous languages, local varieties, and translanguage practices.
Second, teachers need intercultural and multilingual training, so they should know English methodology but also understand language rights, cultural diversity, and inclusive pedagogies.
Also, third, materials and assessments should be contextualized. Teachers can include local stories, community experiences, indigenous knowledge, portfolios, and oral histories.
Exactly. Finally, policy design should include communities, indigenous peoples, teachers, students, families, and local leaders should participate in decisions about language education.
Therefore, language policy improvement requires moving from an English-centered accountability model to a multilingual and intercultural model that values students' languages, communities, and identities.
Well, to close, let's return to our initial question. Are bilingual and multilingual education policies truly inclusive?
Yeah, they can be inclusive, but only if they move beyond an English centered model. So, Colombia is not simply a Spanish speaking country learning English, but Colombia is a multilingual and multicultural country.
All right, yeah. A truly inclusive language policy should not ask students to leave their language behind in order to become bilingual. So instead, it should help them expand their linguistic repertoires while protecting their identities and cultural memories.
In conclusion, language education policies must balance global opportunities with local justice. English matters, but indigenous languages, Creole languages, Spanish varieties, and students' cultural identities matters too. Thank you so much for listening.